she was a whisper of a child, deemed less than the dust motes dancing in the slivers of moonlight that occasionally pierced their hovel's gloom, a burden her parents cast off as easily as one might discard a spoiled rind of fruit. Their voices, sharp as shattered glass, had etched into her nascent soul the belief that she was an empty space, a hollow thing undeserving of warmth, of food, of life itself. So, when they led her deep into the whispering woods, the place of shadows and forgotten things, and walked away without a backward glance, a part of her, the part that had always known this grim destiny, wasn't surprised. She cried, yes, small, gulping sobs that the ancient trees absorbed without comment, her tears mingling with the damp earth. But then, through the haze of her terror and the numbing cold, a new sound emerged, the thud of an axe, the presence of another. A lumberjack, a man carved from the very heartwood of the forest, stumbled upon this fragile, discarded life. He saw not a burden, but a flicker of humanity in desperate need. Could such an encounter, born of cruelty and chance, rewrite a destiny already etched in stone? Could a heart, taught only its own worthlessness, learn the language of love and belonging from a stranger in the wild? The last word she heard from her mother was stay, a command delivered with the chilling finality of a slammed door, the sound swallowed by the indifferent rustle of leaves. Her father hadn't spoken, his silence a heavy cloak that smothered the last vestiges of her childish hope. Elara, all of 6 winters old though she felt ancient with sorrow, watched their backs recede, 2 diminishing shapes against the deepening green, until they were consumed by the forest's embrace, an embrace that felt to her like the jaws of some patient beast. She stood, rooted by a terror so profound it stole her breath, her small hand still outstretched as if to grasp the phantom threads of their departure. The forest, moments before a place of shadowed mystery on their forced march, now loomed as a monstrous entity, its every rustle a whisper of threat, its every shadow a lurking predator. The air, crisp and cool when they began, now seemed to seep into her bones with an icy malice, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, the very perfume of abandonment. She sank to her knees, the rough ground scraping her skin, a pain too distant to register against the gaping wound in her chest. Her world had shrunk to this patch of unfamiliar woods, the tall trees silent, judging sentinels. The sun, a distant, uncaring eye, began its slow descent, painting the canopy in hues of orange and blood before surrendering to the creeping indigo of twilight. "Mama," Ishi whispered, the sound a fragile thing, easily lost. "Papa." Only the echo, or perhaps the sigh of the wind, answered. Hunger, a dull ache at first, gnawed with increasing ferocity, a physical manifestation of the emptiness her parents had left behind. She remembered the stale crust of bread she'd been given that morning, a meager offering that now seemed a feast. Her stomach cramped, and she curled into a tighter ball, pressing her face against her knees, trying to conserve the fading warmth of her own small body. The woods were not silent. There were creaks and groans from the trees, the distant hoot of an owl, the scuttling of unseen creatures in the undergrowth. Each sound was magnified, distorted by her fear into something monstrous. She thought of the stories whispered in the village, tales of wolves with eyes like embers and spirits that lured lost children to their doom. Were they coming for her? Was this her punishment for being unwanted, for being a drain on their meager resources? Her mother's face, usually pinched and sour, swam in her mind's eye, the lips forming the familiar words, useless. Too small. Another mouth we cannot feed, the words had been stones, pelting her, bruising her, until she believed them to be the truest things in the world. As darkness truly fell, a thick, inky blackness that even the stars seemed hesitant to pierce, a despair colder than the forest floor settled over Elara. She cried, no longer the small, gulping sobs, but a raw, desolate weeping that shook her tiny frame. She cried for the warmth of a blanket, for the illusion of safety her wretched cot had provided, for the rough hand of her mother that, however infrequent, had sometimes brushed her hair. She cried because she was alone, utterly and terrifyingly alone, in a world that had declared her surplus to its requirements. The little girl, whose existence had been a quiet apology, now faced the stark reality that her apology had not been enough. She was nothing. Less than nothing. Just a speck of shivering misery in an uncaring wilderness, waiting for the end her parents had so casually ordained. The wind picked up, a mournful sigh through the branches, carrying the scent of rain and a deeper, more primal chill. Elara closed her eyes, a single, defiant tear escaping to trace a cold path down her cheek. She was so tired, a weariness that went beyond the physical, down into the marrow of her small, fractured being. Maybe it would be better to sleep, to let the cold take her, to finally stop being a burden to anyone. The thought was a strange comfort, a dark lullaby in the heart of her desolation. She was just a child, but the forest was already teaching her its harsh, impartial lessons about survival, and about the profound, crushing weight of being utterly alone. The sound, when it first came, was alien, a rhythmic intrusion into the natural symphony of the night forest. Thump. Pause. Thump. Ilara, huddled at the base of a sprawling oak, its gnarled roots a poor substitute for a protective embrace, flinched. Her senses, already stretched taut by hours of fear, sharpened to an almost painful degree. The thumping grew louder, closer, accompanied by the crunch of leaves under heavy footfalls. It wasn't the stealthy tread of a forest predator, not the furtive scuttling she'd imagined earlier. This was deliberate, powerful. A man. Her heart, a trap bird, battered against her ribs. Men were her father, his heavy silences, his rare, rough shoves. Men were the loud, boisterous figures in the village who ignored children like her, or worse, eyed them with casual disdain. She pressed herself further into the hollow beneath the roots, a tiny, trembling creature trying to merge with the earth. She wished she could disappear, become invisible, a mere shadow amongst shadows. The footfalls stopped. A low grunt, the sound of effort, then a different noise, the resonant thwack of an axe biting into wood, followed by the splintering groan of a falling branch. He was close. Too close. Ilara held her breath, praying to any god she didn't know existed that he wouldn't see her, wouldn't notice the pathetic bundle of rags and fear she had become. Then, a shadow fell over her. A figure loomed, silhouetted against the faint starlight filtering through the canopy, impossibly large. She squeezed her eyes shut, a silent scream trapped in her throat. This was it. The wolves hadn't come, but something else had. Something worse, perhaps. A low voice, rough like bark but carrying a surprising gentleness, rumbled above her. Well now, what's this? A little bird fallen from its nest. Ilara risked a peek through slitted eyelids. The man was huge, clad in thick, worn clothing that smelled of pine sap and wood smoke. A thick, untamed beard covered much of his face, but his eyes, even in the dim light, seemed to hold a glint of something other than menace. Concern? He knelt, the movement slow, deliberate, as if approaching a frightened animal. Easy there, little one. Didn't mean to scare you. His voice was deep, like the rumble of distant thunder, yet it didn't hold the sharp edges she was used to. Ilara remained frozen, every instinct screaming at her to flee, but her limbs were locked, heavy as stone. He extended a hand, large and calloused, palm up, in a gesture that was clearly meant to be reassuring. She flinched violently, scrambling back, scraping her arm against a sharp root. A small whimper escaped her. The man withdrew his hand slowly. All right, all right. No harm meant. Just surprised to find someone so small out here all alone. Are you lost, child? Lost? She was more than lost. She was discarded, thrown away. How could she explain that? The words wouldn't come, choked by fear and the deeply ingrained lesson that her voice, her needs, were irrelevant. He waited, his gaze steady. He didn't shout. He didn't grab her. He just waited. The silence stretched, broken only by Ilara's ragged breathing and the distant sigh of the wind. Finally, he spoke again, his tone soft. It's getting colder. And there are creatures in these woods not kind to little ones. You can't stay out here. He looked around, then back at her. I have a cabin. Not far. It's warm. There's food. Warmth. The words were like distant bells, summoning a response from the deepest, most primal part of her. But trust was a fragile, shattered thing. Her parents had promised safety, and they had delivered her to this. Why would this stranger be any different? Yet, something in his stillness, in the quiet patience of his demeanor, was different. He wasn't trying to trick her with false smiles or sweet words. He was just there. Solid. Like the ancient trees around them. He sighed, a sound that seemed to carry a hint of sadness. Look, child. I won't force you. But the night is long, and the frost will be cruel. Come with me. Just for the warmth. You can leave in the morning if you wish. He stood slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. He slung his axe over his shoulder, then picked up a bundle of firewood he'd evidently been gathering. He looked down at her one last time. I'm Silas. I live just through those trees. He gestured with his chin. The path is easy to follow. If you change your mind. And then, he began to walk away, not looking back. Elara watched him go, torn. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to stay hidden, to trust no one. But the cold was seeping deeper, a relentless enemy, and the gnawing hunger was a constant torment. The image of a warm cabin, the promise of food, warred with the ingrained terror of adult betrayal. He hadn't forced her. He'd given her a choice. A choice! That was new. Her parents had never given her choices. She listened to his receding footsteps. He wasn't far. What if he was telling the truth? What if, just for a little while, she could be warm? Shivering uncontrollably now, Elara made a decision born more of desperation than courage. She pushed herself up on trembling legs, her scraped arm throbbing, and took a hesitant step in the direction Silas had gone. Then another. Each step was an agony of fear, but the thought of the encroaching frost, of another night alone in the terrifying darkness, was a more immediate horror. She was a tiny shadow, flitting between the trees, following the faint sounds of a giant she hoped, against all experience, might be kind. The journey to Silas's cabin was a blur of stumbling steps and heart-pounding fear, yet Elara clung to the faint sounds of his passage like a drowning sailor to a piece of driftwood. The darkness of the deep woods was absolute, punctuated only by the distant, cold light of stars that seemed to mock her smallness. Each snap of a twig under her worn shoe sounded like a gunshot in the stillness, and she imagined unseen eyes watching her from the impenetrable blackness between the trees. But the image of Silas's broad back, his unhurried, steady pace as he'd walked away, offered a strange, anchoring point in her terror. He hadn't tried to coax her, hadn't cajoled or threatened. He had simply stated a truth: the night was cold, the forest dangerous, and offered an alternative. This absence of pressure was so alien to her experience that it disarmed a tiny fraction of her fear, allowing a desperate sliver of hope to penetrate. When the trees thinned slightly, revealing a faint, flickering orange glow ahead, her breath hitched. A cabin, small and sturdy, nestled in a clearing, a wisp of smoke curling from its stone chimney like a welcoming finger. It looked like something from a forbidden dream, a sanctuary of warmth and light in a world that had only shown her its harshest aspects. Silas was on the porch, his silhouette framed by the light spilling from the open doorway. He wasn't looking for her, just unlacing his heavy boots, his movements unhurried. He hadn't waited, hadn't hovered. He'd trusted her to make her own choice, or perhaps he'd simply accepted that she might not come. This, more than anything, made her take the final, trembling steps into the edge of the light. He looked up then, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. He didn't smile, nor did he frown. He simply nodded, a slight inclination of his head. "Come in, child." "It's warmer inside." He pushed the door open wider and stepped aside, allowing her to pass. The interior of the cabin was small, a single room, but it was filled with a warmth that enveloped Elara like a gentle embrace. A fire crackled merrily in a stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn log walls. The air smelled of wood smoke, dried herbs, and something else, something savory that made her stomach clench with a painful, hopeful pang. There was a simple wooden table and 2 chairs, a cot covered with thick furs in one corner, and shelves filled with jars and bundles of dried plants. It was rustic, basic, yet it exuded a sense of peace, of order, that was utterly foreign to the chaotic neglect of her former home. Elara stood just inside the doorway, clutching her scraped arm, feeling overwhelmingly small and out of place. She was a creature of dirt and shadows, and this place felt clean. Safe. Too good for her. Silas moved quietly, ladling something from a pot simmering over the fire into a wooden bowl. The aroma intensified, a rich, meaty stew. He placed the bowl on the table, along with a chunk of dark bread. "Eat," he said, his voice still that low rumble. "It's not much, but it's hot." He didn't watch her. Instead, he went about his own tasks, adding a log to the fire, checking something in a wooden box. Ilara's gaze was fixed on the steaming bowl. Hunger, a fierce, undeniable force, warred with her ingrained fear. Was it a trick? Would he snatch it away if she reached for it? Would there be a price? Her parents had taught her that nothing was free, especially kindness. But the smell was intoxicating, and the warmth of the cabin was already beginning to thaw the ice in her veins. Hesitantly, her eyes darting toward Silas, she approached the table. He seemed oblivious to her, his attention focused on sharpening a small knife. Taking a deep breath, she reached for the spoon. It was heavy, wooden, and felt strange in her small hand. The first mouthful of stew was an explosion of flavor and warmth. It was simple food, meat, vegetables, herbs, but to Ilara, it tasted like heaven. She ate quickly, hunched over the bowl, half expecting it to be taken away at any moment. But Silas didn't move, didn't speak. He just continued his quiet work, the rhythmic rasp of the whetstone a strangely soothing sound. When she had scraped the bowl clean, even using the bread to mop up the last drops of gravy, a profound weariness settled over her. The warmth, the food, the sudden cessation of immediate terror, combined to drain her of all remaining energy. Her eyelids grew heavy. Silas looked up then, his eyes meeting hers. There was no judgment in his gaze, no expectation. "There's a cot in the corner," he said, gesturing with the knife. "Furs are warm. Sleep. In a strange place, with a strange man." Her mind screamed caution, but her body, exhausted and finally fed, yearned for rest. She looked at the cot, piled high with soft-looking animal pelts. It looked far more inviting than the cold, hard ground of the forest. Slowly, she made her way to it, every movement an effort. She didn't undress, didn't dare remove her tattered clothes. She simply crawled under the heavy furs, pulling them up to her chin. They smelled faintly of pine and man, but beneath that, they were simply warm, deeply, wonderfully warm. From under the furs, she watched Silas. He finished sharpening his knife, then sat at the table, mending a piece of leather harness by the firelight. He didn't look at her. He seemed content in his solitude, a silent, self-contained mountain of a man. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Ilara felt a tiny, fragile seed of something other than fear. It wasn't trust, not yet. It was something far more tentative. A sense of respite. The fire crackled. The cabin was silent save for the sound of Silas's breathing and the occasional shift of logs in the hearth. Gradually, despite the turmoil in her heart, despite the ghosts of her parents' faces that flickered at the edges of her vision, Ilara's eyelids drooped, and she succumbed to an exhausted, uneasy sleep, the first she'd had under a roof that wasn't her own, with a stranger who had, for now, shown her an unexpected, undemanding kindness. Ilara awoke to the smell of wood smoke and something sweet, like baked apples. For a disoriented moment, she didn't know where she was. The unfamiliar weight of the furs, the soft give of the cot beneath her, the dim light filtering through a small, grime-covered window, it was all wrong. Then memory rushed back, the forest, the cold, the looming figure of Silas, the cabin. Her heart gave a frightened leap, and she burrowed deeper under the furs, her eyes darting around the small space. Silas was not there. The fire in the hearth had been banked but still radiated a gentle warmth. A tin plate with a piece of what looked like honey cake and a small, wizened apple sat on the floor beside her cot. Her stomach rumbled. Hesitantly, she peeked out. The cabin door was slightly ajar, and she could hear the rhythmic thud of an axe from outside, distant enough not to be immediately threatening. He was chopping wood, his morning routine perhaps. The food was clearly for her. Again, this offering without demand, without scrutiny. It was deeply unsettling, yet undeniably alluring. She was still so hungry. Cautiously, she reached for the plate, The honey cake was dense and moist, surprisingly delicious. The apple was tart but juicy. She ate slowly, listening to the sounds from outside, every sense on high alert. Days passed in a similar fashion. Ilara remained mostly silent, a small, watchful shadow in the corner of Silas's solitary existence. She spoke only when absolutely necessary, a whispered yes or no, her voice raspy from disuse and fear. Silas, for his part, seemed to expect nothing more. He moved about his routine with a quiet efficiency, chopping wood, checking his trap lines, always far from the cabin, he assured her with a glance when she'd flinched at the mention of traps, mending his tools, cooking their simple meals. He never pressed her to speak, never asked about her past. He simply provided food, warmth, and a surprising degree of unobtrusive presence. He would leave small offerings for her, a freshly baked bannock, a handful of late-season berries he'd found, a curiously shaped stone. He'd place them where she could see them, then go about his business, allowing her to approach them in her own time. Her internal world was a tempest. Every act of kindness from Silas was filtered through the lens of her past experiences. Why was he being kind? What did he want? Her parents had never been kind without expecting something in return, usually her silence, her invisibility, or her labor at some small, demeaning task. The idea of disinterested kindness was a concept so alien it felt like a trap. She spent hours replaying her mother's sharp, dismissive words, her father's heavy, indifferent presence. "You're a curse, girl," her mother had hissed once, when a small bowl of milk had been spilled. "Worthless." Just another mouth, the words were branded onto her soul. How could this stranger, this giant of a man, not see the worthlessness that was so glaringly obvious to her own parents? One afternoon, a fierce autumn storm blew in. The wind howled like a hungry wolf around the eaves of the cabin, and rain lashed against the small window pane. Ilara, who had been tentatively sitting by the hearth, jumped at a particularly violent gust that rattled the door in its frame. She huddled into herself, her eyes wide with fear. The storm outside mirrored the storm inside her. Silas, who had been carving a piece of wood, looked up. He saw her terror, the way she trembled. He didn't say anything reassuring, no empty platitudes. Instead, he simply got up and bolted the door more securely. He added another log to the fire, and the flames leaped higher, casting a warmer, more cheerful glow. Then he returned to his seat and his carving, his presence a quiet, solid bulwark against the raging elements. He began to hum, a low, tuneless sound that was surprisingly comforting. Ilara watched him, her fear slowly receding, replaced by a strange sense of security. The storm raged on, but inside the cabin, it was warm, and the big man seemed completely unperturbed. He was a part of this wildness, she realized, not afraid of it. And for now, she was sheltered with him. Later, when the worst of the storm had passed and only a steady drumming of rain remained, Silas held out the piece of wood he'd been carving. It was a small, rough bird, its wings slightly uplifted. He placed it on the hearth near her. "For you," he rumbled, not looking at her, already reaching for another piece of wood. Ilara stared at the little wooden bird. It was simple, unadorned, yet there was a certain life to it. A gift. Given freely. She tentatively reached out and touched it. The wood was smooth under her small fingers. She didn't thank him, the words were still locked away, but she picked up the bird and held it tightly in her lap. It was the first beautiful thing she had ever owned. That night, as she lay under the firs, clutching the wooden bird, a memory surfaced. Her mother, younger, her face less pinched, humming a lullaby. It was a fleeting image, quickly overwhelmed by more recent, harsher memories, but it was there. A tiny crack in the wall of her despair. Silas's quiet, consistent kindness was like water seeping into parched earth. It wasn't dramatic, wasn't demanding, but it was persistent. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, something within Ilara began to shift. The terror was still there, a constant companion, but it was no longer all-consuming. There were moments, brief and fragile, where she felt safe. And that, for a child who had known only the opposite, was a profound and bewildering change. The first word Ilara spoke to Silas beyond a monosyllabic response was a question, uttered so softly it was almost lost in the crackle of the morning fire. She had been watching him mend a tear in his thick leather glove, his large hand surprisingly deft with the needle and coarse thread. He worked with a focused patience that she was beginning to recognize as characteristic of him. A small squirrel, emboldened by Silas's stillness and the absence of any threat from the girl in the corner, had ventured onto the porch, visible through the slightly open door. It paused, twitched its nose, then scampered off with a chattering cry. "Why, bird?" Ilara whispered, her voice a tiny, hesitant thread of sound. She was clutching the small wooden bird he had carved for her, its smooth surface a comfort in her palm. Silas paused in his mending, his needle hovering. He didn't look at her immediately, giving her space, as if understanding the enormous effort that small question had cost her. Then, he slowly turned his head, his eyes, usually fixed on his task or the distant tree line, meeting hers. "Birds are free," he said, his voice its usual low rumble. "They go where they please. Sing their own songs." Seemed a good thing he didn't elaborate, didn't ask why she'd asked. He simply answered, then returned to his glove. Ilara pondered his words. Free. She had never felt free. She had always been trapped, by her parents' indifference, by their poverty, by their cruelty. The concept of freedom was as abstract as the stars. Yet, watching the real birds flit between the trees outside the cabin, hearing their varied calls, she began to sense what he meant. There was a lightness to them, an unburdened quality. Silas, in his own way, began to teach her about the forest, not with formal lessons, but through his actions and occasional, brief explanations. He showed her which berries were safe to eat, pointing them out with a calloused finger, the deep purple of huckleberries, the tart red of lingonberries. He taught her to recognize the tracks of different animals in the soft earth around the cabin, the delicate prints of deer, the heavier tread of a bear, which he assured her kept its distance, the busy tracings of squirrels and rabbits. He never forced her to come close, never insisted she learn. He would simply point, murmur a name, and continue his way. But Ilara watched. She absorbed everything, her young mind a sponge, starved for knowledge that wasn't laced with bitterness or threat. One crisp morning, he took her a little way from the cabin, to a spot where the sunlight filtered through the golden leaves of aspen trees, turning the clearing into a cathedral of light. He knelt and showed her a tiny, perfect spiderweb, glistening with dew, strung between two ferns. "See," he said softly. "Everything has its place. Everything makes something beautiful, if you look close enough." Ilara stared at the intricate web, a marvel of delicate engineering. She thought of her mother's words, useless. Was it possible that even she, Ilara, could have a place? Could make something beautiful? The thought was too radical, too frightening to fully embrace, but it lodged in her mind, a tiny seed of doubt against the certainty of her worthlessness. There was a minor crisis when Ilara, venturing a few steps further from the cabin than usual while Silas was checking a snare line for rabbits, stumbled and twisted her ankle. The pain was sharp, bringing tears to her eyes, and a wave of panic washed over her. She was alone, injured. What if Silas didn't come back for a long time? What if a wolf found her? She tried to stand, but a fresh stab of pain made her cry out, a small, frightened sound. It seemed like an eternity, but it was probably only minutes before Silas appeared, moving with surprising speed for such a large man. He saw her crumpled on the ground, her face pale, and was by her side in an instant. "What happened?" he asked, his voice laced with a concern that felt shockingly real. Through her sobs, she managed to point to her ankle. He examined it gently, his rough fingers surprisingly tender. "Sprained, I think." Not broken. Without another word, he carefully lifted her into his arms. She was so light, he carried her as if she weighed nothing. Ilara, expecting roughness, perhaps an impatient word for her clumsiness, was stunned into silence. She buried her face in his coarse, pine-scented shirt, a strange sense of security washing over her. He carried her back to the cabin, laid her on the cot, and expertly bound her ankle with cool, damp cloths and strips of linen. He brought her a warm drink sweetened with honey and sat by her, quietly whittling, until she drifted into an uneasy sleep. When she awoke, the pain in her ankle had dulled to a throb, and Silas was banking the fire for the night. He looked over at her. "Better?" he asked. She nodded, her throat tight. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely audible. It was the first time she had thanked him for anything. He merely grunted in acknowledgement, but she thought she saw a faint softening around his eyes. The incident, though minor, shifted something further within her. He hadn't blamed her. He had cared for her. The consistent, undemanding kindness was slowly, painstakingly, eroding the fortress of her fear. The belief that she was a burden, an annoyance, was still deeply entrenched, but Silas's actions were like gentle waves, repeatedly washing against that harsh foundation, beginning to wear it away, grain by painful grain. The forest outside the cabin, once a symbol of terror and abandonment, was slowly, through Silas's quiet tutelage, beginning to reveal its other faces, a place of subtle beauty, of intricate life, of sustenance, and, under his watchful eye, even a place of burgeoning safety. The days continued to shorten, the air growing crisper with the undeniable scent of approaching winter. Ilara's ankle healed quickly under Silas's patient care, the enforced rest bringing with it a new level of quiet interaction between them. She would watch him for hours as he worked, mending his worn clothes with thick, clumsy stitches that were nonetheless effective, sharpening his axe until it gleamed, or carefully preparing hides from the rabbits he caught, stretching them on small frames to dry. He never seemed to mind her scrutiny. Sometimes, he would speak, not to her directly, but as if thinking aloud, naming the tools he used, or explaining a particular knot he was tying. "This one's a bowline," he might murmur, his fingers deftly manipulating the rope. "Good knot. Won't slip." Ilara would listen, absorbing the information, filing it away. She began to understand that his life was one of constant, practical skill, a deep knowledge of how to survive, how to make and mend, how to live in harmony with the often unforgiving wilderness. One afternoon, Silas brought in a small, orphaned lamb, its mother likely taken by wolves. It was weak, bleating pitifully. Ilara, who had flinched from most animals, felt an unexpected pang of sympathy for the tiny, trembling creature. Silas prepared a mixture of warmed goat's milk. He kept a couple of hardy goats in a small pen behind the cabin, and painstakingly tried to feed the lamb with a rag soaked in the milk. It was a clumsy process. After watching him struggle for a while, Ilara, without a word, reached out a hesitant hand. Silas paused, looking at her. She pointed to the lamb, then to herself. A silent offer. He considered her for a moment, then slowly handed her the rag and the bowl of milk. Ilara cradled the lamb gently, her small fingers surprisingly adept at coaxing its mouth open and dripping the milk onto its tongue. It was a slow, messy business, but the lamb began to suckle weakly. A strange warmth spread through Ilara. She was helping. She was doing something useful. Silas watched her, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. He didn't praise her, didn't comment, but simply went back to his own task, leaving her with the lamb. For the next few days, caring for the lamb became Ilara's responsibility. She named it Snow, for its white, fluffy wool. She fed it, kept it warm by the fire, and even whispered to it when Silas was out of earshot. The simple act of caring for another living being, something even smaller and more helpless than herself, began to unlock something within her. It gave her a purpose, however small. The false belief that she was inherently useless, a burden, began to fray at the edges. Here was tangible proof that she could contribute, could nurture. Snow, under her care, began to thrive. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the cabin filled with the comfortable silence that had become their norm, Ilara spoke, her voice a little stronger than before. "My mother, she said I was a stone." Cold and useless, the words hung in the air, heavy and raw. It was the first time she had ever spoken of her mother in anything more than a fragmented whisper. Silas stopped his whittling. He looked into the fire for a long moment, his brow furrowed. Then he turned to Ilara, his gaze direct but gentle. "Stones aren't useless, child," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Stones build hearths. They build walls. They give shelter. And some stones," he picked up a smooth, grey river stone from the mantelpiece, "are beautiful, just as they are. Strong. Enduring. He placed the stone in her small hand. It was cool and solid. Ilara looked from the stone to his face, a whirlwind of emotions churning within her. He wasn't dismissing her pain, wasn't offering empty platitudes. He was offering a different perspective, a way of seeing value where she had been taught there was none. She didn't see, Ilara whispered, more to herself than to him. No, Silas agreed quietly. Sometimes, folks are too caught up in their own darkness to see the light in others. His words were simple, yet they resonated deeply within Ilara. It was a revolutionary idea, that her mother's assessment might have been wrong, a reflection of her mother's own limitations rather than Ilara's inherent lack of worth. The forest, which she was now beginning to explore in small, tentative forays with Silas, was also becoming a teacher. He showed her how to read the signs of the changing seasons, the way the squirrels frantically buried nuts, the V-formations of geese flying south. He pointed out the hardy plants that clung to life even as the frosts began, the tenacity of the evergreens. Everything struggles, he told her once, watching a small pine sapling that had taken root in a rocky crevice. But everything tries to reach for the sun. Ilara looked at the little tree, so small and yet so determined. She felt a kinship with it. She too was struggling, but perhaps, just perhaps, she was also, in her own faltering way, beginning to reach for a metaphorical sun. The fear was still there, a shadow that never fully receded, but it was no longer the dominant force in her life. Curiosity, a fragile sense of belonging, and the first stirrings of self-worth were beginning to take root in the slowly healing soil of her heart. The bond between Ilara and Silas continued to strengthen, woven from shared silences, simple routines, and the quiet lessons of the wilderness. Ilara, no longer a trembling wraith confined to the darkest corner of the cabin, now moved with a little more confidence. She helped Silas with small tasks, fetching water from the nearby stream, gathering kindling, even attempting to mend a small hole in her own tattered dress with a needle and thread he provided, her stitches uneven but earnest. Each completed task, no matter how minor, was a small victory against the ingrained belief of her own incompetence. Silas, in turn, treated her not as a burden, but as a companion, albeit a very quiet one. He would share observations about the forest, point out a hawk circling overhead, or the way the frost painted intricate patterns on the fallen leaves. He never pushed her to respond, content to share his world with her. The little lamb, Snow, had become a fixture by the hearth, its gentle bleating a soft counterpoint to the crackling fire and the sigh of the wind outside. Caring for Snow gave Ilara a consistent, tangible focus for her burgeoning ability to nurture. She found a strange solace in its simple needs, its trusting presence. And hey there, as Ilara is finding her place and learning to trust, if you're enjoying her journey and want to see how her story unfolds, this would be a wonderful time to hit that subscribe button. Your support helps us bring more stories like Ilara's to life. And if you're feeling it, a like or a comment to let us know what you think would be amazing. We love hearing from you. Alright, back to Ilara and Silas, and the deepening winter in their secluded world. One afternoon, Silas returned from checking his traplines with a thoughtful expression. "Found something you might like," he said, his voice holding a hint of anticipation. He reached into his pack and pulled out a small, crudely made book. Its pages were fashioned from thin, scraped pieces of hide, bound together with leather thongs. On the cover, he had scratched a simple drawing of a bird in flight. "Made this," he said, a touch of awkwardness in his tone. "Thought you might like to draw." Or something. He then produced a few charred sticks and a small, smooth piece of slate. Ilara stared at the offering, her eyes wide. A book. Her own book. And tools to make marks. In her old life, such things were unimaginable luxuries, reserved for people who mattered. She reached out a trembling hand and took the book. The hide pages were soft, pliable. The smell of wood smoke and leather clung to them. "For me," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. Silas nodded, already turning away to busy himself with the fire, embarrassed by his own sentimentality. Ilara clutched the book to her chest. It was the most precious gift she had ever received, even more so than the wooden bird, because it suggested something about her future, about her potential. That evening, By the flickering firelight, Ilara opened her book. She picked up a charred stick, hesitating for a long moment. What should she draw? Her mind was a blank. Then, she looked at Snow, dozing peacefully by the hearth. Tentatively, she began to sketch, her strokes clumsy at first, but gradually gaining a hesitant confidence. She drew Snow, then the wooden bird Silas had carved, then a simple flower she had seen growing near the stream. Silas, seemingly engrossed in mending a snowshoe, watched her from the corner of his eye. He said nothing, but a quiet satisfaction settled over him. He had seen the spark of intelligence in her eyes, the way she absorbed everything around her. He couldn't offer her formal schooling, but he could offer her tools, encouragement, and the space to discover her own talents. The forest itself became a source of inspiration. Silas began to show her how to make pigments from crushed berries and colored clays, how to use a feather as a quill. Ilara's little book slowly began to fill with images, the tall pine surrounding the cabin, the deer that sometimes ventured into the clearing at dawn, the intricate patterns of snowflakes. Her drawings were simple, childlike, but they were hers. They were a way for her to process the world around her, to give form to the emotions that still swirled within her. The act of creation was healing. It was a way of asserting her existence, of saying, I am here. I see. I feel it was a quiet rebellion against the voices from her past that had tried to tell her she was nothing. As winter deepened, blanketing the forest in a thick layer of snow, the cabin became their entire world. The isolation could have been oppressive, but instead, it fostered a deeper intimacy between them. They developed a rhythm, a comfortable routine of shared tasks and quiet companionship. Ilara even began to hum sometimes, small, tuneless melodies, echoing Silas's own unconscious habit. He taught her simple card games, using a worn, greasy pack he'd had for years. Her laughter, when it finally came, was a revelation, a light, tinkling sound that seemed to chase away some of the lingering shadows in the cabin. It startled both of them the first time, but Silas's answering smile, a rare and precious thing, encouraged her. The fear of her past was not gone, but it was slowly being overlaid with new experiences, new memories of warmth, safety, and a dawning sense of self. The girl who had been left to die was, inch by painstaking inch, learning how to live. The deep peace of their isolated winter was unexpectedly disturbed one late afternoon. A sharp, unfamiliar sound cut through the stillness of the snow-covered forest, the baying of hounds, distant but drawing nearer. Ilara, who was carefully adding a touch of berry juice to a drawing of a robin in her hide-bound book, froze, her head snapping up, eyes wide with a resurgence of old terror. Silas, who had been outside splitting firewood, entered the cabin quickly, his expression grim. "Stay inside, Ilara. And be quiet," he commanded, his voice low but urgent. He barred the door, then went to the small window, peering out cautiously. The baying grew louder, closer, accompanied now by the shouts of men. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. Men. Strangers. The outside world, which she had almost managed to forget, was intruding, bringing with it the threat of the unknown, the potential for disruption, for a return to the fear and uncertainty she had known before Silas. She scrambled to the darkest corner of the cabin, pulling Snow, the lamb, close to her, her small body trembling. Silas remained at the window, his broad shoulders blocking much of the view, a silent, formidable protector. Soon, two figures emerged from the tree line, rough-looking men bundled in furs, each leading a pair of lean, aggressive-looking dogs on leashes. They stopped near the edge of the clearing, their dogs straining and barking towards the cabin. One of the men, tall and wiry with a mean squint, shouted, "Ho, the cabin! Anyone in there?" Silas didn't answer immediately. He seemed to be assessing them. Then, he unbarred the door and stepped out onto the porch, positioning himself squarely in the doorway, his presence alone a deterrent. "What do you want?" Silas's voice was a low growl, devoid of welcome. The wiry man's eyes narrowed. "We're tracking a wolf. A big one. Been taking livestock down near the settlement. Tracks led this way. Seen anything?" "Haven't seen a wolf near here in weeks," Silas replied, his tone flat. Just me and our business. He deliberately kept his statement vague. The second man, shorter and heavier, scanned the cabin with greedy eyes. Cozy little place you got here. All alone in these woods, RYA. There was an unpleasant insinuation in his voice. Elara, listening from inside, pressed herself further into the shadows, her breath held tight. She could feel the menace radiating from these men, a stark contrast to Silas's quiet strength. Alone enough, Silas said, his gaze unwavering. The wolf went east, if it came this way at all. You're wasting your time here, the wiry man spat on the snow. Maybe. Maybe not. We could use a warm drink, a bit of rest before we head on. It was less a request and more a demand. Silas's stance didn't change. Not offering hospitality today. Best you be on your way. A tense silence descended. The dogs whined and tugged at their leashes, sensing the standoff. Elara could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. She prayed they would leave, prayed they wouldn't try to force their way in. The wiry man took a step forward, a sneer on his face. Not very neighborly, RYA, woodsman? What are you hiding in there? Just as he spoke, Snow, startled by the raised voices, let out a distinct, albeit small, BA. Elara clapped a hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. Too late. The men's heads snapped towards the sound. What was that? The heavy man asked, a cruel grin spreading across his face. Sounds like you got fresh meat in there, friend. And maybe something else you ain't telling us about. He took another step, his hand moving towards the hunting knife at his belt. Silas moved with a speed that belied his size. He stepped fully out of the doorway, his hand dropping to the handle of the woodsman's axe that always leaned just inside the door frame. He didn't lift it, but his fingers curled around the worn wood, a silent, deadly promise. I told you, Silas said, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm, you're not welcome here. And what's inside my cabin is my concern, not yours. Now, leave. Before you regret disturbing my peace. There was something in his voice, a core of iron, a hint of savagery held barely in check, that made even the aggressive dogs falter. The two men exchanged a look. They were hunters, used to intimidation, but Silas was something different. He wasn't just a settler, he was a man of the deep woods, as wild and unyielding as the ancient trees themselves. The wiry man hesitated, his eyes flicking from Silas's implacable face to the axe handle, then back. He clearly hadn't expected such firm resistance. After a long, charged moment, he grunted. All right, woodsman. Have it your way. But if that wolf doubles back, and we lose its cause of you. It won't, Silas interrupted, his voice flat. Now go. The men, muttering under their breath, reluctantly turned and trudged back into the trees, their dogs still grumbling. Silas watched them until they were out of sight, his posture rigid. Only when the last sound of their passage had faded did he relax slightly, letting out a slow breath. He turned and came back inside, barring the door securely. Elara was still huddled in the corner, trembling violently. The encounter had shattered the fragile peace she had begun to feel, catapulting her back into a state of acute fear. Silas came over to her, kneeling down. It's all right, Elara, he said, his voice softer now, though still carrying a trace of the earlier tension. They're gone. You're safe. She looked up at him, her face pale, her eyes filled with tears. They were bad men, she whispered. Yes, Silas agreed. Some men are. But they won't be back. He gently stroked Snow's head, then looked at Elara. You were brave. You stayed quiet, just like I asked. Brave? She didn't feel brave. She felt terrified. But his words, his calm reassurance, slowly began to soothe her frayed nerves. He had protected her. He had stood between her and the threat, a solid, unshakable shield. This incident, terrifying as it was, served to solidify Elara's growing trust in Silas. He was not just kind in the quiet moments, he was a fierce protector when danger arose. Her world, which had briefly felt threatened, settled back into its familiar, safe parameters, But with a new understanding, safety wasn't just the absence of her parents' cruelty, it was also the active presence of Silas's strength and vigilance. She was no longer just a discarded thing, she was someone worth protecting. And that realization was a profound balm to her wounded spirit. The visit from the hunters, though unsettling, had an unexpected consequence. It brought Ilara's past into sharper focus, stirring up memories and emotions she had kept deeply buried. Nightmares, which had lessened in frequency and intensity, returned with a vengeance. She would wake up gasping, her heart pounding, the images of her parents' cold faces or the menacing leer of the hunters vivid in her mind. One night, a particularly bad dream left her sobbing uncontrollably, curled into a tight ball on her cot, Snow bleating in distress beside her. Silas, awakened by the sound, was at her side instantly. He didn't try to hush her or tell her it was just a dream. He simply sat on the edge of her cot, his large, warm hand resting gently on her shoulder, a silent, comforting presence in the darkness. When her sobs subsided into ragged gasps, he spoke, his voice a low rumble in the quiet cabin. "Bad dreams?" Ilara nodded, unable to speak, tears still streaming down her face. "Want to tell me about it?" he asked softly. "Or just sit a while?" She hesitated. Talking about it felt dangerous, like giving the bad memories more power. But Silas's quiet patience, his unwavering presence, made her feel, for the first time, that perhaps she could share some of the darkness without being consumed by it or judged for it. My father," she began, her voice trembling. He used to lock me in the cellar. When I cried. Or when there wasn't enough food," the words came out in broken whispers, each one a painful exhumation. "It was so dark. And cold. And there were rats." She shuddered violently at the memory. Silas's hand tightened slightly on her shoulder. He said nothing, just listened, his silence an invitation to continue if she wished. He said I was a nuisance. That I deserved it. That I was bad. The deeply ingrained belief of her own badness, her own inherent fault, poured out with the confession. My mother, she never stopped him. She just watched. Ilara buried her face in her hands, a fresh wave of grief and shame washing over her. Was I, Silas? Was I so bad? The question hung in the air, raw and desperate. Silas was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the dim light from the dying embers in the hearth. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with a deep, resonant empathy. No, Ilara, he said, his tone unequivocal. You were not bad. You were a child. And children deserve kindness, and food, and warmth. Not cellars and rats. He paused, then continued, his voice firm but gentle. The badness, child, was not in you. It was in them. In their hearts. They were the ones who failed. They failed to protect you. They failed to love you. That is their shame, Ilara, not yours. His words were like a balm on a festering wound. She had carried the weight of her parents' cruelty for so long, believing it to be a just punishment for her own inadequacy. To hear someone, this strong, kind man whom she had come to trust implicitly, state so clearly that the fault lay with them, not her, was a revelation. It was as if a heavy cloak she hadn't even realized she was wearing had been lifted from her shoulders. But why are she whispered, the question that had haunted her for years. Why would they? Silas sighed, a deep, sorrowful sound. Sometimes, Ilara, people are broken. Life breaks them, or they are born with a darkness inside them. And broken people, sometimes they break other things. Even the small, innocent things they are supposed to cherish. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a profound sadness. It's not an excuse for what they did. There is no excuse. But it might be a reason. It doesn't make what happened to you right. It was wrong. Terribly wrong. He reached out and gently brushed a tear from her cheek with his calloused thumb. What they did, Ilara, that's their story. Their failure. Your story is different. You survived. You found your way here. You are strong. You are kind. You care for Snow. You make beautiful drawings in your book. He gestured towards the little hidebound book on the small table beside her cot. That is who you are, Ilara. Not what they tried to make you believe you were. Ilara listened, absorbing his words, letting them sink deep into her soul. It was a lot to take in, a fundamental shift in her understanding of her own past, of her own identity. The pain was still there, a dull ache that might never fully disappear, but it was no longer intertwined with the crushing weight of self-blame. That night, Ilara slept more peacefully than she had in a long time. The nightmares didn't vanish completely, but they began to lose their power. Silas's words had given her a new lens through which to view her past, a lens of compassion for the child she had been, and a dawning understanding that she was not defined by the cruelty she had endured. In the days that followed, Ilara found herself looking at her reflection in the still water of the stream with new eyes. She was still small, still thin, but she no longer saw just the useless, bad the child her parents had described. She saw a survivor. She saw a girl who was learning, growing, finding her voice, however quiet. She was Ilara. And her story, as Silas had said, was her own to write. The forest, once a place of terror, now felt more like a sanctuary, its ancient trees witnesses to her slow, painstaking healing. The harshness of winter began to relent, giving way to the first, tentative signs of spring. The snow receded, revealing the damp, eager earth beneath. Tiny green shoots pushed their way through the leaf litter, and the calls of returning birds filled the air with a renewed vibrancy. For Ilara, this awakening of the natural world mirrored an awakening within herself. The conversations with Silas, especially the one following her nightmare, had been pivotal. The heavy burden of her perceived worthlessness, so long her constant companion, had begun to lift, replaced by a fragile but growing sense of self-acceptance. She found herself smiling more often, small, genuine smiles that reached her eyes. Her laughter, once a rare and startling sound, became more frequent, especially during their evening card games or when Snow, now a boisterous young lamb, did something particularly comical. She even started to initiate conversations with Silas, asking him questions about the plants and animals, about his life before he came to the woods, though he remained largely reticent about his own past, preferring to focus on the present. One day, Silas was attempting to repair a leaking bucket, his large hands fumbling with the small, fiddly pieces of wood needed for the patch. He grumbled in frustration, a rare occurrence. Ilara, who had been watching him, quietly picked up a smaller, more pliable twig and, with surprising dexterity, showed him how it might better fit the awkward curve. Silas paused, looked at her suggestion, then at her, a flicker of surprise and pride in his eyes. "Well now," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "That's clever, Ilara." Very clever. He used her idea, and it worked. For Ilara, his simple words of praise were like sunshine after a long winter. She had contributed. She had solved a problem. She felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the fire. This small success emboldened her. She began to take more initiative in their shared life, anticipating Silas's needs, helping with chores without being asked, her movements becoming more confident, less hesitant. She started to feel less like a guest, or a rescued stray, and more like a part of the cabin, a part of their small, two-person, and one-lamb world. Her art also blossomed. Her hidebound book was now filled with drawings, no longer just simple sketches, but more detailed observations of the forest around her. She had even started to add color, using the crushed berries and clays Silas had shown her. One afternoon, a traveling tinker, a rare visitor to these remote parts, passed by the cabin. He was an old, weather-beaten man with a kind smile and a pack full of wonders, pots, pans, needles, colorful ribbons, and small trinkets. Silas, usually wary of strangers, traded some well-cured furs for essentials like salt, a new knife blade, and, to Ilara's surprise, a small pouch of brightly colored glass beads. The tinker, noticing Ilara's shy curiosity and the book of drawings she clutched, asked to see her work. Hesitantly, with a glance at Silas for reassurance, she showed him her pictures. The old man's eyes widened in genuine appreciation. "Well, bless my soul," he exclaimed. "These are wonderful, child. You have a true gift." Such an eye for detail. He pointed to a drawing of a blue jay, its feathers rendered with surprising accuracy. This is as fine a drawing of a jaybird as I've ever seen. Ilara flashed with pleasure, a feeling so new and potent it almost overwhelmed her. No one, in her entire life, had ever praised her talent, because no one had ever believed she possessed any. The tinker, before he left, pressed a small, intricately carved wooden flute into her hands. For the little artist, he said with a wink. Every artist needs music. Ilara was speechless. She looked at Silas, who simply nodded, a quiet approval in his eyes. That evening, after the tinker had departed, Ilara sat by the fire, turning the flute over and over in her hands. Tentatively, she put it to her lips and blew. A clear, sweet note emerged. She tried again, her fingers fumbling for the holes. It was clumsy at first, but with Silas's quiet encouragement, just like breathing, Ilara. Find the song inside you, she began to experiment. Soon, she was able to produce simple, hesitant melodies. The music, like her drawings, became another way for her to express the emotions that were too deep for words. It was a song of sorrow, yes, for the past she could never entirely escape, but it was also a song of hope, of resilience, of a dawning joy. One crisp spring morning, Silas found Ilara sitting by the stream, not drawing, not playing her flute, but simply watching the water flow. Snow, the lamb, grazed peacefully beside her. She looked up as he approached, and there was a new light in her eyes, a quiet confidence that transformed her small face. Silas, she said, her voice clear and steady. Thank you. He knew she wasn't just thanking him for the beads or for allowing the tinker to visit. She was thanking him for everything. For rescuing her. For believing in her. For giving her a chance to find herself. He merely grunted, uncomfortable as always with overt displays of emotion, but his eyes were soft. You did the hard work, Ilara, he said gruffly. You're the one who found your way, but Ilara knew that she hadn't done it alone. She had found her way because he had provided the light, the safety, and the unwavering belief that she was worth saving. The forest, once a symbol of her deepest fears and abandonment, was now her home, her sanctuary, her teacher. And in the heart of that wilderness, alongside a gruff, kind lumberjack, the little girl who had been left to die had finally, truly, begun to live. She was no longer defined by the cruelty of her past, but by the quiet strength and blossoming creativity of her present. She had found her voice, her talent, and most importantly, her worth. The seasons turned, each one etching a deeper sense of belonging into Ilara's soul. The vibrant greens of summer deepened into the rich golds and crimsons of autumn, and then the world was hushed once more under a blanket of winter snow. Through it all, Ilara grew, not just in stature, but in spirit. The timid, terrified child was a distant memory, replaced by a quiet, observant young girl with a gentle strength and a surprising resilience. Her days were filled with purpose. She helped Silas with the myriad tasks required for their self-sufficient life, tending their small vegetable garden in the summer, gathering firewood, preserving food for the winter, mending clothes, and caring for Snow, who had grown into a fine, if somewhat overly pampered, sheep. Her art and music continued to flourish. Her hidebound book was now a treasure trove of an entire year in the forest, its pages filled with detailed sketches of flora and fauna, landscapes in different seasons, and even a few surprisingly accurate portraits of Silas, capturing his gruff kindness in the set of his jaw or the gentle crinkles around his eyes. The melodies she coaxed from her wooden flute were no longer hesitant, they were clear and true, echoing the sounds of the forest, the ripple of the stream, the whisper of the wind through the pines, the calls of the birds. Sometimes, as Silas sat by the fire in the evenings, whittling or mending, Ilara would play for him, the sweet notes filling the small cabin with a sense of peace and contentment that was more profound than any words. He never explicitly praised her music, but she would often see him pause in his work, his head tilted slightly, a faraway look in his eyes, and she knew he was listening, truly listening. He had given her more than just shelter, he had given her the space to heal, to grow, to discover the person she was meant to be. He had taught her, through his quiet example, the value of patience, resilience, and a deep, abiding respect for the natural world. He had shown her that strength was not about harshness or cruelty, but about quiet endurance and unwavering kindness. One late autumn afternoon, as the first snowflakes of the season began to drift down, Ilara was helping Silas stack firewood against the cabin wall. She paused, looking out at the familiar landscape, the tall pines, the distant, snow-dusted peaks, the small stream now beginning to ice over at the edges. A profound sense of peace settled over her. This was her home. This was where she belonged. She turned to Silas, a thoughtful expression on her face. "Silas," she began, her voice clear and steady, "do you ever miss other people? The village? Before?" He stopped his work, leaning on his axe, and looked out at the forest, his gaze distant. It was a question she had wondered about but had never dared to ask so directly. He was silent for a long moment, then sighed, a puff of white mist in the cold air. "Sometimes," he admitted, his voice a low rumble. "Sometimes I miss the sound of a fiddle band, or the taste of fresh bread from a proper baker's oven. But mostly—" He paused, then turned to look at her, a rare, gentle smile touching his lips. "Mostly, I found more peace here, with you, Ilara, than I ever found out there." His words, simple and heartfelt, filled Ilara with a warmth that chased away the autumn chill. She had not just found a refuge with Silas, she had become a part of his life, someone who brought him peace, just as he had brought it to her. The initial thematic question, posed by the starkness of her abandonment, could a heart taught only its own worthlessness learn the language of love and belonging, had been answered, not with a resounding declaration, but with the quiet, steady rhythm of their shared life. Yes, it could. It had. Ilara was no longer the whisper of a child, defined by her parents' cruelty. She was Ilara of the forest, the girl who drew beauty from the wild, who coaxed music from a simple wooden flute, who had a gentle hand with animals and a spirit as resilient as the ancient pines that surrounded their cabin. She had faced the deepest darkness and had emerged into the light, not unscathed, but whole. The scars of her past would always be a part of her, a reminder of where she had come from, but they no longer defined her. They were simply part of the tapestry of her life, a life that was now rich with meaning, purpose, and a quiet, enduring love. As the snow began to fall more heavily, blanketing the forest in a pristine white, Ilara and Silas finished stacking the wood and went inside the warm, firelit cabin. Snow, the sheep, greeted them with a soft bleat. Ilara picked up her flute, and as Silas settled into his chair by the fire, she began to play, a melody that was both melancholic and hopeful, a song of survival, of healing, and of a love found in the most unexpected of places. The little girl who had been left to die was now home, her heart finally, truly, at peace.